Lyra's kindness was the only warmth Jin-Guk had felt in years, but in a building made of glass and ice, warmth is a liability. As episode 2 begins, the janitor finds himself backed into a corner by a man desperate to prove his power. It started with a missing watch and a loud accusation, but it's about to end with a choice. Will Lyra risk her only sanctuary to defend a man the world calls trash? Or will Jin-Guk be forced to drop the mop and show the sixth floor exactly who he really is? The sixth floor of the Hansong Tower was a sterile labyrinth of glass cubicles and high-tension ambition, a place where Jin-Guk's presence as a janitor felt like an unsightly stain on a white silk tie. He was working the late shift, the hum of the floor's industrial floor polisher, providing a low, rhythmic drone that masked the predatory whispers of the middle managers still tethered to their desks. Among them was Manager Park, a man whose insecurity was as loud as his cheap cologne. Park had spent the last week treating Jin-Guk like a footstool, intentionally kicking over waste bins just to watch the janitor stoop to clean them. But tonight, the malice in Park's eyes had shifted from casual bullying to something more calculated and lethal. He stood by the gold-trimmed elevator bank, tapping a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen against his palm, a luxury item that Jin-Guk recognized as a gift he had personally authorized for the department heads last Christmas. The trap was sprung with a theatrical suddenness that made Jin-Guk's syndicate instincts flare. Park let out a sharp, practiced cry of "thief" that echoed through the marble hallway, instantly drawing a small crowd of curious, judging eyes. He pointed a trembling finger at Jin-Guk's supply cart, claiming that his heirloom watch, a piece he valued at $50,000, had gone missing from his desk the moment the janitor entered his office. Jin-Guk stood perfectly still, his hand gripping the handle of the mop with a white-knuckled intensity. He could have ended Park in 4 seconds. He knew exactly where the man's carotid artery pulsed beneath his sweating neck. But the rules of the gamble were absolute. He was a nobody, a ghost, and a ghost had no defense against the word of an executive. 2 security guards, men who used to bow so low their foreheads touched the floor when Jin-Guk walked past, moved in to seize his arms, their faces twisted in the same disgust Park was projecting. Just as the metal cuffs were produced, a small, defiant shadow broke through the circle of suits. Lyra had been waiting near the service exit for their nightly meeting, and she didn't hesitate for a single heartbeat. She stepped between the towering security guards and Jin-Guk, her faded green hoodie a stark, jarring contrast to the sea of navy blue blazers. Her voice was small but carried a resonance that silenced the room. She looked Park dead in the eye and told him he was lying. She explained that she had been watching through the glass partition from the hallway, waiting for her friend, and she saw Park slip the watch into his own breast pocket before the janitor ever stepped inside the room. The air in the hallway turned arctic. For a homeless girl to call a manager a liar in the heart of the Hansong Empire was social suicide. She was effectively banning herself from the only warm lobby in the district, risking the only safety she had left for a man she believed had nothing. Park's face turned a violent shade of purple, his hand instinctively reaching for his pocket to hide the evidence she had just named. He sneered at her, calling her a gutter rat and threatening to have her arrested alongside the thief, but the seeds of doubt had been sown among the onlookers. Jin-Guk watched Lyra's back, her shoulders trembling slightly from fear, but her stance remaining unshakable. He felt a profound, aching shift in his chest. He had spent his life surrounded by lieutenants who would take a bullet for him because of his rank. But here was a girl who was willing to lose everything for Worker 402. She wasn't defending the sovereign, she was defending the human being. As the security guards hesitated, realizing Park's hand was indeed hovering guiltily over his pocket, Jin-Guk realized that the 30-day gamble had already been won. He had found his queen in the most unlikely of places, and as he looked at Lyra's brave, tired profile, he He silently vowed that the men who had dared to threaten her would soon learn that the janitor they mocked was the god who owned their lives. The 30th dawn broke over Seoul in a cold, clinical gray, the sun struggling to pierce a heavy layer of industrial fog that clung to the glass spires of the Hansong district. For Han Jin-Guk, the morning air felt heavy with the weight of an impending transition, a shedding of the rough, abrasive skin he had inhabited for a month. He stood in the damp basement locker room of his own tower, staring at the gray jumpsuit hanging on a rusted hook. The fabric was stained with the toil of 1,000 floors and the spilled coffee of a dozen insults, yet it felt more honest than any silk tie he had ever knotted. He was minutes away from reclaiming the throne, from signaling to Choi and his hidden lieutenants that the sovereign had returned. The gamble was over. He had found a loyalty that transcended gold, and he had found it in a girl who lived in the cracks of the city he owned. He reached into the locker, his fingers brushing against a small velvet box he had smuggled in, a ring that cost more than the building's annual electricity bill, intended for the girl in the green hoodie. He ascended to the lobby one last time as Worker 402, his heart drumming a rhythm of quiet anticipation. He scanned the alcove near the service entrance, the place where Lyra always sat on her tattered backpack, her presence a soft light against the cold marble. But the corner was empty. The space where she usually huddled was barren, the floor scrubbed clean of her existence, as if she had never been there at all. Jin-Guk felt a sudden, icy needle of dread pierce through his chest. He checked the delivery bays, the subway entrance, and the narrow alleyways where they had shared their shared crusts of bread, but there was only the hollow whistle of the wind and the indifferent rush of the morning commuters. He asked a security guard, a man who had watched Lyra defend him only days prior, where the girl had gone. The guard merely shrugged, a cruel smirk playing on his lips as he told the janitor that the gutter rat had been cleaned out by a black van during the night shift. In that heartbeat, the janitor died. The humble, head-bowed worker who endured the spit of the elite evaporated, replaced by a vacuum of cold, lethal energy that made the air in the lobby turn brittle. Jin-Guk didn't say a word. He simply turned and walked toward the private, gold-plated elevator that had been off-limits to him for 30 days. The security guard moved to block him, shouting for him to get back to his mop, but Jin-Guk didn't break his stride. He reached out, his hand moving with the blur of a striking cobra, and gripped the guard's throat. The man's eyes widened in terror as he looked into Jin-Guk's gaze, no longer the tired eyes of a laborer, but the abyssal, terrifying stare of the dragon. The tape on Jin-Guk's knuckles peeled back as he tightened his grip, revealing the dark, intricate ink of the syndicate tattoos in all their predatory glory. He leaned in, his voice a low, vibrating growl that promised nothing but ash. "Where is she?" The guard's knees buckled as the elevator doors chimed and slid open. Out stepped Choi and a dozen men in black suits, their heads instantly bowing in a synchronized display of absolute submission. "Welcome back, Chairman," they whispered in unison, their voices echoing off the marble. Jin-Guk tossed the gasping guard aside like a piece of refuse and stepped into the elevator, his presence expanding until it filled the entire hall. He stripped off the gray jumpsuit in one fluid motion, standing in the center of his soldiers with his tattooed chest heaving. The experiment was over, but the peace was gone. He looked at Choi, his voice cold enough to freeze the blood in a man's veins. "I want every camera in the district. I want every black van in the city stopped. If a single hair on her head is touched, I will burn Seoul to the ground to find the ashes." The dragon had returned, and this time, he wasn't looking for loyalty, he was looking for blood. The command center of the Hansong syndicate was a cathedral of high-frequency data and cold blue light, a place where the world was stripped down into heat maps and digital footprints. Han Jin-Guk stood at the center of the glass-floored room, his presence so oppressive that the air conditioning seemed to fail against the heat of his rage. He was no longer wearing the coarse gray jumpsuit that had defined his last 30 days. In its place was a custom-tailored, obsidian black armored suit, reinforced with liquid metal plating that shimmered like dragon scales under the fluorescent glow. The heavy signet ring was back on his finger, and the dark, intricate ink on his knuckles was fully exposed, a silent promise of the violence to come. To his left, Choi worked with frantic speed, his fingers dancing across a holographic display that mapped every street corner in Seoul. The janitor was a memory. The sovereign had returned to his throne, and the city was about to feel the weight of his shadow. "Found them, Chairman," Choi whispered, his voice trembling as a red dot flickered on the map near the abandoned industrial docks of Incheon. The surveillance feed showed the black van Jin-Guk had seen in the rain, tucked behind a rusted warehouse. But as the data poured in, the truth began to unravel. Lyra wasn't just a girl from the streets. She was the last surviving daughter of the Baek family, a rival house that had been systematically dismantled by loan sharks and scavengers after her father's mysterious death. She was being hunted for a blood debt she hadn't created, a legacy of gold and grief that had forced her into the shadows to protect her life. The realization that she had been suffering in the cold while he watched her from behind a mop, all while she shared her last crust of bread with him, sent a fresh wave of agony through Jin-Guk's chest. She had been a princess in hiding, and he had treated her like an experiment. He didn't wait for a tactical briefing. He turned and walked toward the private hangar, his boots echoing with a heavy metallic finality. A fleet of 12 armored black SUVs was already idling, their engines growling like beasts waiting for the hunt. Behind them, 2 attack helicopters sat on the rooftop helipad, their rotors beginning to churn the thick, humid air of the evening. Jin-Guk climbed into the lead vehicle, his eyes fixed on the red dot. He wasn't going there to negotiate or to pay a debt. He was going to erase anyone who had dared to touch his light. The transition from the humble worker to the god of the underworld was complete, and as the convoy tore through the city streets, bypassing every traffic light with the authority of a king, the citizens of Seoul felt a collective chill. The dragon was awake, and he was hungry. The warehouse at the docks was a tomb of rusted iron and salt spray. As the convoy slammed to a halt, Jin-Guk stepped out, the wind whipping his hair across his face. He didn't signal his men to wait. He walked toward the heavy steel doors alone, the armored plating of his suit humming with a low, kinetic energy. Inside, he could hear the muffled cries of a girl and the coarse laughter of men who thought they were powerful because they held a knife to a captive. With a single, explosive kick, the steel doors buckled and flew off their hinges, crashing into the concrete floor with a sound like a thunderclap. Jin-Guk stepped into the dim, yellow light of the warehouse, his silhouette framed by the roaring helicopters behind him. He looked at the men holding Lyra, his voice a low, vibrating growl that signaled the end of their lives. "You touched what belongs to me," he said, his tattooed hand reaching for the hilt of a blade concealed at his side. "Now I will show you why they call me the dragon." The industrial warehouse erupted into a symphony of shattered glass and splintered wood as Jin-Guk's men descended from the skylights, their movements synchronized and lethal. The air was instantly choked with the smell of cordite and the sharp, rhythmic crackle of suppressed gunfire. Amidst the chaos, Jin-Guk moved like a ghost made of shadow and steel, his armored suit absorbing the flickering yellow light of the overhead lamps. He didn't take cover. He simply walked through the hail of lead, his gaze locked on the small, huddled figure tied to a rusted chair at the center of the room. Every man who stood between him and Lyra fell before they could even scream, dispatched with a clinical, terrifying precision that transcended mere combat. He was a force of nature, a god of death wearing the face of a man she had once fed from her own hand. When he finally reached her, he sheared through her zip-tie restraints with a single fluid stroke of a combat knife, his tattooed knuckles gleaming in the muzzle flashes. Lyra collapsed into his arms, her body trembling with a violent, rhythmic shivering. But as she looked up, her eyes didn't fill with the relief of a victim saved. They widened with a raw, primal terror. She looked at the blood on his obsidian armor, the cold, vacant intensity in his eyes, and the way 100 armed men stood in the shadows, waiting for his silent command. This wasn't the man who had shared her stale bread behind a marble pillar. This wasn't the tired janitor who had struggled with a heavy mop. The man holding her moved with the predatory grace of a king, his presence so vast and suffocating that it seemed to push the very oxygen out of the warehouse. She pushed against his chest, her breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps, her voice a fragile whisper that barely carried over the fading echoes of the skirmish. "Who are you?" she asked, her eyes searching his face for a trace of the person she thought she knew. "What have you done with him?" Jin-Guk felt a jagged, hollow ache in his chest, a pain far more acute than any bullet could inflict. He reached out to touch her cheek, but she flinched, recoiling from the dark syndicate ink that marked his skin like a brand of Cain. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic thumping of the helicopters circling above. He realized then that in saving her life, he had murdered the only version of himself she had ever loved. He stood up, his height looming over her like a mountain, and looked out through the shattered warehouse doors. Behind them, the Seoul skyline was a jagged crown of fire and light, reflecting off the dark waters of the Incheon harbor. He turned back to her, his voice no longer the rough rasp of a laborer, but the deep, resonant authority of the sovereign. "My name is Jin-Guk," he said, the words falling like stones into a well. "I own the tower where we met. I own the streets where you slept. I am the man who hunts the people who hunted you." The revelation hung in the air, a cold and heavy truth that seemed to drain the remaining warmth from the room. Lyra looked at him, her tears carving clean tracks through the grime on her face, her expression a devastating mixture of betrayal and confusion. She realized that the janitor was a lie, a billionaire's game played while she was fighting for her very survival. He had watched her struggle from behind a mask of poverty, a god playing at being a beggar. Jin-Guk saw the light in her eyes dim, replaced by a distance that made his empire feel like a tomb. He had destroyed her world to rescue her, and now he stood amidst the ruins of his own deception, a king who had finally found a queen, only to realize he had terrified her into silence. The city burned behind them, a backdrop of gold and ash for a man who had everything, yet had just realized he might have lost the only thing that actually mattered. The following evening, the Hansong Tower did not hum with its usual corporate indifference. It pulsed with a terrifying, rhythmic silence. A fleet of 12 obsidian black sedans pulled onto the private curb, their engines cutting out in a synchronized growl that seemed to stop the very heart of the city. Jin-Guk stepped out of the lead vehicle, his custom-armored suit replaced by a hand-stitched midnight blue tuxedo that caught the moonlight like a predator's coat. He reached back into the car, his hand, now free of the athletic tape and grime of the basement, extending toward Lyra. She emerged slowly, draped in a silk gown the color of an evening sky, her small frame still trembling slightly from the weight of the transition. She looked at the glass doors of the lobby, the place where she had once hidden from the rain, and saw a sight that made her breath hitch in her throat. The grand hall was lined with hundreds of employees, from the high-ranking executives to the security guards who had once mocked them, all standing in a rigid, terrifying line of submission. As Jin-Guk led her through the revolving doors, the sound of 500 heads bowing in unison echoed like a thunderclap against the marble. "Welcome back, Chairman. Welcome home, Lady Lyra," they chanted, a sea of navy blue suits bending low before the girl in the green hoodie's ghost. Manager Park, the man who had tried to frame him, was on his knees near the center of the hall, his forehead pressed against the cold floor he had once forced Jin-Guk to scrub. The power in the room was suffocating, a physical manifestation of Jin-Guk's true reach, yet as he looked down at Lyra, he saw only a profound, aching sadness in her eyes. He led her to the very pillar where they had shared their bread, a space now cordoned off by velvet ropes and guarded by men with submachine guns. He turned to her, his voice a low, vibrating murmur that ignored the hundreds of witnesses. "This is all yours, Lyra. The tower, the city, the men who bow to you. I have cleared your family's debt and erased your enemies. You will never have to hide in the rain again." He waited for the light to return to her face, for the gratitude that any other woman in Seoul would have offered him on bended knee. But Lyra didn't look at the gold-trimmed elevators or the shivering executives. She looked at his hands, the clean, manicured hands of a billionaire, and then at the spot on the floor where he used to kneel with a mop. Tears welled in her eyes, not of joy, but of a quiet, devastating mourning. "I don't want the chairman, Jin-Guk," she whispered, her voice a fragile needle of truth that pierced through his armor. "I don't want the man who owns the city. I want the man who was tired. I want the man who listened to me talk about the stars when he had every reason to be somewhere else. You gave me an empire, but you took away my friend." The silence that followed was heavier than any decree, a realization that the sovereign had won the war, but was losing the only heart he had ever truly coveted. Jin-Guk felt the hollow chill of his own success. He reached out, his thumb catching a falling tear, and for a fleeting second, the cold mask of the dragon slipped, revealing the man who had been changed by a crust of bread. He realized that loyalty wasn't found in the bowing crowd, but in the girl who loved him when he was a ghost. He turned away from her, his gaze sweeping across the lobby with a lethal, icy finality that made the executives shiver. He didn't offer a speech or a corporate mission statement. He spoke a single, chilling decree that was broadcast to every syndicate branch and every police precinct in the city. "From this night forward, this lobby belongs to her. And let the word go out to every corner of the underground. Anyone who looks down on a man with a mop, anyone who spits on the invisible, and anyone who dares to touch my janitor, you answer directly to the boss." He took Lyra's hand, leading her toward the elevator, finally understanding that he wasn't bringing her into his world. He was desperately trying to keep the piece of her world that had finally made him human. In a world built on glass and greed, Lyra gave Jin-Guk something that money couldn't buy, a moment of truth. She loved a man who had nothing, and now she must learn to love a man who owns everything. Can the silence they shared in the lobby survive the noise of a criminal empire? Only time will tell. Thanks for riding along for this journey from the dirt of the lobby to the gold of the penthouse. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video if you believe true loyalty is worth more than any bank account. Until next time, remember, never judge a man by his uniform.